Right, hello again, and welcome to the seventh of these GCSE revision videos. Today, what we're going to be looking at is the role of education in society, and specifically theoretical views on the role of education. So if you haven't tuned in before, then go back and have a look at some of the previous videos. I've done 6 of them. The first one was like on an introduction to sociology, and then the rest of them, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, have all been on the family. So today we're looking at theories on the role of education. This one is going to take you through the functionalist view, the Marxist view, the feminist view, and then also at the end, what we're going to do is have a bit of a look at a very typical essay that you might get given on this in the GCSE exam for EduCAS. So it would be a 15-mark essay, okay? But if you don't study the EduCAS course, this is still going to be relevant for you because all of the theories, they don't change. They say what they say, and pretty much every exam board is going to ask you about theoretical views on education. So without further ado, let's get into the mix. So let's start by looking at the functionalist view of the role of education. And if you're not quite sure yet already about like what these theories say generally, go back to the lesson or the session that I did on the theories of the family, because I give an overview there, but I'm not going to do that this time. I'm going to get straight into it. So when we think about what functionalists consider about the education system, what they would say basically is that it's a fair system. They call it meritocratic, or talk about education being a meritocracy. And meritocracy is based on 2 key ideas. Firstly, you've got the idea that everyone has equality of opportunity, so everyone has the chance to do well, but it's hard work that's going to get rewarded, and those rewards will be good grades, and that will then lead to the best jobs in society. So effectively, functionalists say that everyone has a chance of doing well in school. It's those who perform and work the hardest who get the best grades and then go on to the best jobs in society. So it plays this function of kind of sifting and sorting people according to what they're good at, basically. Now, one of the key concepts when we look at education is the hidden curriculum, which is everything that you might learn not in lessons. So it might be things you just learn as a result of being in school, things like obedience, respect, punctuality, those kind of things. And they would argue, functionalists would argue, that the hidden curriculum plays a positive role because it gives us these skills, these like life skills, if you will, that prepare us for work and are going to teach us what we need to know in order to get on well and function as members of society. So let's have a look at a couple of different functionalist theorists and what they say. Now, the first one of these will be not be new to you because I talked about him in relation to his views on the family. It's Talcott Parsons, and effectively Parsons, as every functionalist does, sees education positively. He argues that one of the roles education performs is that it acts like a bridge, and this bridge goes between the family and wider society or the workplace. So what Parsons is getting at here is that, like, education and schools provide a different kind of socialization to what you'll get with your family. So I think I said in a previous video, it's the idea that, like, remember when you were at like nursery school and you made this really crappy picture made out of like macaroni and silver spray paint, and you stuck the macaroni on a bit of paper and then you sprayed it and it was lovely, and you took it home to mum and dad and they were like, wow, look at this amazing picture, let's stick it on the fridge. That's giving you like maximum praise for something that ultimately, yeah, it's nice, but it's not that good. So what Parsons says is at school, you don't get that automatic praise for things that you do, and actually you have to work a little bit harder to get those rewards. So much in the same way that you would do in the workplace, people aren't just going to clap you and give you a bonus or increase your salary for doing like something rubbish or just something part of your job, but they might do that if you do above and beyond. Okay, so this is why education acts as like a bridge between the family at one side and the workplace and the wider society at another. Now, the other kind of 2 functionalists that we're going to look at are really important because we're going to contrast these with some Marxists later on, is Davis and Moore. And Davis and Moore have this concept called role allocation theory. And it's basically the idea that schools kind of sort kids and select kids and sift them into the most appropriate roles according to their efforts and their talents. So basically the idea is that if you work hard at something and you're talented at something, that will be the kind of course that you'll pursue throughout your life, and you'll go and get a job on it. So if you're really good at English, you might well be picked up by your English teachers, get a really good grade, and so for instance you might end up going on to be a journalist. By contrast, if you're excellent at arts, you might have the same kind of experience, you might put loads of effort into your artwork, and as a result you might end up getting a job as a graphic designer. Now Davis and Moore take this a little bit further actually, and they say after school actually this process of role allocation still continues. For example, like, we need to have the best people to do the top jobs, the most important jobs in society. So Davis and Moore argue that through role allocation, this is how we get people who are people like surgeons, lawyers, doctors, those kind of things, dentists, because those people have to train for the most amount of time, they have to put the most amount of effort in, and it's only right then that they get rewarded with the highest salaries. So, you know, think of doctors, lawyers, dentists' salaries, very, very big. Okay, so role allocation, schools sorts you into the correct kind of path or job or role that you are going to be good at and then going to take up later in life. Now, when we come to criticize the functionalist view, there's a whole load of things we can say. So, for instance, one of the things is there are undoubtedly unequal differences in achievement of kids at school in different kinds of groups. So when functionalists say that school is meritocratic, definitely we can criticize that because there are clear differences between, for instance, girls and boys, more higher class, middle class pupils and lower working class pupils, for instance. And definitely Marxists would have a word to say about how education isn't meritocratic. It actually works in favor of the rich. Feminists would also argue that actually schools aren't that functional. In fact, what they are doing is they're just regurgitating and mirroring a patriarchal society. So almost like pushing out this patriarchal ideology and ideas early doors in schools so that people get used to it in schools. In workplaces. So there we go, there's the functionalist view. Let's now have a look at the Marxist view. So basically, if we consider the functionalists see education is fair and that everyone has an equal chance of success, the Marxists disagree with that, because what they argue is that meritocracy, this idea of working hard, everyone has equality of opportunity, they say that is a load of rubbish. It's a myth. So meritocracy is a myth. In fact, schools are rigged almost to benefit the middle and upper classes at the expense of the working class. So Marxists would say that schools both like legitimize, they allow, and they repeat, and they justify inequality after generation. And this is how schools help play into the capitalist system. Now, with the functionalists, we saw that the hidden curriculum plays a positive role. For Marxists, these things that we learn actually play a negative role. Because what they're doing is they're teaching us how to get ready for work and how to be exploited in the capitalist system. For instance, the idea of a hierarchy, there's always going to be a boss in charge, same as at school. There's a hierarchy. You've got your head teacher at the top, then like your deputy head teachers, and then, I don't know, your heads a year or whatever, and then you've got your teachers, then you've got your students, okay? So when we think about like different Marxists who have things to say about the education system, we're going to start off with Bowles and Gintis, because Bowles and Gintis come up with this idea called the correspondence theory, or the correspondence principle, which basically argues that schools correspond or mirror the needs of capitalism and the workplace. And Bowles and Gintis argue that this happens in a couple of ways, but most notably, it's through the hidden curriculum. So we pick up skills that are going to correspond to the needs of capitalism and the needs of the workplace. So one of their arguments is basically that school teaches us almost how to deal with boredom and things like that. So the idea is that some of you will think that school is boring, it's not helpful to you. Bowles and Gintis would agree with you, and they would say that's actually readying you for the role that you're going to play in work, which is going to be boring and alienating and have no satisfaction to it. Okay, so Bowles and Gintis very much opposite to Davis and Moore's role allocation theory. So whenever we talk about Davis and Moore saying a positive role of school, sorting people into these roles and functions that they're going to play in society, Bowles and Gintis are your counter argument to that, because they would say no, schools are working to correspond to the needs of the class system and the capitalist way of life. Okay. Then we've got a couple of other people here. Now, Bourdieu is one of my favorite sociologists. He is very much heavily influenced by Marxism. And his idea isn't necessarily that schools themselves are kind of working to keep the class system in place, but almost that like it's the knowledge of people and what they have that's also going to determine their fate in schools. So Bourdieu comes up with this concept of capital, or cultural capital, which is basically the knowledge, the values, the ideas, and what you know about how schools and how life actually works, okay? And he says that middle class people have this cultural capital. It's like knowledge, beliefs, experiences that only middle class people will have. And because of this, they have this, and schools also value this cultural capital. Now, Bourdieu argues that actually working class people don't have cultural capital. So, for instance, they don't know how schools work. They don't have the experiences of the middle classes, for instance. They might not read books. They might not go to museums, those kind of things. And so, as a result, Bourdieu argues that because schools have cultural capital and they value it, middle class people have that. That matches nicely, and middle class kids get on. Working class kids don't have it, and as a result, don't match with those values of the school, and so aren't kind of, there's like a mismatch between different cultural values, if you will. Incidentally, Bourdieu also came up with this concept called social capital, which is basically the idea of it's not what you know, it's who you know in life. And if you know, for instance, I don't know, people who deal with admissions for universities or teachers at school or tutors and those kind of things, those are kind of people who can help you out with your education. And Bourdieu again argues that it tends to be middle class people who have got that kind of capital, in that case social capital. All right, so let's have a quick look at Paul Willis. So Paul Willis, like a lot of people get this one wrong from time to time, and it's not, you don't need to, basically. A lot of people like confuse Willis with labeling. Willis said nothing about labeling as such. In fact, Willis is almost like the opposite to that. And what he says is like, you've got middle class schools and you've got working class kids in them, and working class kids actually, through their own processes, they are resisting those middle class or like cultural capital of the schools. And so what they do is they ignore those values. They almost enter into a kind of anti-school subculture, so they will have their own values that go against those of the school. So let's say the school wants you to turn up on time, work hard and be quiet in lessons. The values of working class lads or working class subcultures might be not working hard, not keeping quiet and mucking about in lessons, those kind of things. Now, what Willis is arguing basically is because these kids already have this idea in their head, they don't think they need to even try hard, because they think because they're working class, they're going to end up getting working class jobs, much like their dads did anyway. And they don't see the value of doing things in school, like working hard, staying quiet, doing their homework, because they don't think it's going to be useful for their future. So what Willis basically argues is that the working class already have this idea in their head that school isn't meritocratic, so why try hard? Instead, we're going to resist those values, and instead what's going to happen basically is that working class kids are going to get working class jobs, middle class kids are going to get middle class jobs, so there's no point trying to sort of play with that system, so to speak. Okay, so Bowles and Gintis, correspondence theory, Bourdieu in his cultural capital and social capital, and Willis talks about working class resistance to middle class school culture. And then if we're going to criticize Marxism, what can we say? Well, of course, meritocracy is not a complete myth, because if it was, then only the middle class would do well at school. In fact, we've got many examples of working class kids doing very well at school. The classic example I always give in my lessons is someone like Lord Alan Sugar, who I think famously says, oh, I left school with no GCSEs or whatever, and look at him, he's a multi-millionaire or whatever. So use that as an example. The other thing we can talk about is this role of the hidden curriculum. And so Marxists argue that the hidden curriculum works to produce work-ready individuals. Well, it doesn't always work like that, especially if we take up the ideas of Willis, and he talks about resistance to those middle-class values. So it doesn't always work that schools produce ready-made workers for the capitalist system. And then finally, we might argue that not everything benefits capitalism, because that's the Marxist's basic argument is that everything in the world is set up, or everything in society is set up to benefit capitalism and keep the rich rich and the poor poor. But that can't be true, because we are teaching Marxism in school. And surely if the education system was the way it was, like how Marx said and how other Marxists have argued, they wouldn't let us get away with teaching this stuff in school. So it can't exactly be completely benefiting capitalism all the way through. So here we go. We've done functionalism. We've done a bit of feminism. We've not done feminism. We're doing feminism now. We've done functionalism. We've done Marxism. Let's bang on to a bit of feminism. So what have we got? Well, as with every feminist argument about basically anything in society, the whole point of social institutions, in this case education, is it's set up to maintain and justify that gender inequality, so differences between boys and girls, or the way boys and girls are seen and represented. So when we look at feminist arguments traditionally, they would argue that schools are patriarchal and they're reflecting this patriarchal system in the wider society. So schools are run by men in favour of men to reflect that patriarchal system. But things have definitely changed over the last sort of 35 years or so. And we've actually had a big change in terms of how we can look at the feminist argument, because girls significantly outperform boys on almost every measure in school. So perhaps that needs a bit of updating. But the other thing we can talk about as well is about, like I mentioned earlier, about the representation, how boys and girls are either labelled in school, how they're talked about, how the expectations that are of them from teachers and things like that. Don't forget about things like gendered subjects. So we've got subjects, for instance, like engineering, resistant materials and technology, that are very much boys, male dominated subjects. And then equally in technology, we've got things like textiles and food tech that are heavily female dominated. Now, what's kind of interesting in that is if you look at the role of like food tech or something like that, or even textiles, who are the big chefs? Who are the big fashion designers in the country and in the world? They're men. So this might be something that feminists have got something to say about. Let's have a look at some of the arguments then. So Becky Francis has a really interesting argument, and she basically says is that schools do reflect the patriarchal nature of school because boys are allowed to dominate both the space in school and the time and attention of teachers. So the example that Francis gives is if you look at how students behave at like a break time or a lunchtime, when they're out on the field, what are the boys doing? The boys are playing football. And to play football, you need like a really big space, don't you? And you need like goals and stuff like that. So boys are taking up all of this space on the field. Meanwhile, where are the girls while this is going on? They're around the outsides, right? Because they can't sit in the centre spot or on the D or anything like that, because if they do, they're going to get a ball in the face. And I'm sure we don't really want that. So Francis argues that boys dominate space in schools, much like they dominate space in society. And as a result, girls are literally, in that example of the football pitch on the school field, are marginalised to the outsides of the pitch or society, much in the same way that feminists would argue that women are marginalised in society. And all that word means is that they aren't really seen to be that important. If you imagine a bit of paper with a margin on it, I haven't even got one in front of me, the margin is that little bit on the left-hand side. That's not the important bit. The main important bit is that bit of paper, yeah? So the other thing that Francis argues is that boys take up a lot more of teacher time and teacher attention and things like that. And again, Francis argues that that is a reflection of male dominance of time and attention in society, e.g. through the media and stuff like that. But Sue Lees offers an interesting take on how schools almost are like a breeding ground for patriarchy, and that she says that they're a place where patriarchy and sexual double standards start to show themselves, I guess. So she talks about the way in which schools are breeding grounds of sexual control, and she talks about sexual double standards. And what she means by this is the ways in which boys and girls are treated differently according to how promiscuous they are. And if you don't know what promiscuous means, it means having sex with a lot of people, a lot of different people. So Lees would argue something like when boys are known to have slept with a lot of people or have kissed a lot of girls or anything like that, they're labelled a lad or a stud or something like that. You know, it's a positive label, really, for well done, mate, that kind of thing. If it's girls that are known to be promiscuous, they're labelled things like a slag or a sket or anything like that, and that's a negative label. So we're seeing already the same behaviour from boys and from girls, but treated very differently in the school setting. So how can we criticise the feminist argument? Well, as I mentioned already at the start of this section, in the last 30 years, since the Education Reform Act in 1988, which brought in things like coursework and GCSEs and standardised testing and all that kind of stuff, girls have outperformed boys in almost every measure. I think the only kind of subject that boys slightly do better than girls in is maths as well. So in every other subject, girls are basically outperforming boys. So how can we argue that schools are like a breeding ground of patriarchy and male dominance when girls are doing incredibly well and boys are perhaps lagging behind a little bit? Many people talk about the idea that there's actually in the last 30 years or so been a feminisation of education. And so this is the idea basically that schools are now female spaces. And if you look at your own school, I would imagine that it would reflect the national percentage of teachers being about 2/3 female, okay? So more teachers are female, but think about the hierarchy again. Who's at the top? Is it a male head teacher? Have you got a male like assistant head teachers and stuff like that? The general rule of thumb is that whilst females are most heavily teachers, the most heavily, that's a rubbish way of putting it, but the most heavily people in the most senior positions are male, okay? And then the other thing we want to be just saying again, are these ideas all a little bit out of date? And do we perhaps need a bit of a reinvention of the feminist ideas about the role of education? So that's another criticism you can throw at that. So what I've done is I've gone through the functionalist view, the Marxist view, and the feminist view for you. And I'm going to go through a very typical essay that you might get on theories of education. Now, this is the time where if you don't take the EduCAS exam board, this is the time you don't really want to listen to it. Just fast forward or whatever. Thanks for watching and everything. But this, if you do take this, you might find this very helpful because I'm going to show you a very typical essay, which would read something like this. The main role of education is to keep women and the working class in their place. Do you agree with this view? Now, the first thing you've got to try and work out is what is this question asking? What it's basically saying is, does education work to keep gender inequalities as they are and class inequalities as they are. So it's basically saying, do you agree with the feminist and the Marxist view of education? Now, you've got to talk about both those things, but the other thing you're going to have to do is talk about an alternative theory, which is going to be functionalism. So I'm going to show you how you might structure an essay based on this question. So first of all, you're going to have to put a little introduction in this. As a 15-mark essay, you need an introduction, you need 3 paragraphs, and you need a conclusion as well if you want to hit the top band. So my introduction would be something like this. There are 3 sociological theories that have a view on the role of education. Marxists and feminists might argue or might agree that the role of education is to keep women and working class in their place, but functionalists would not. Then I'm going to go into my first paragraph, and I'm going to call these Peel paragraphs. So that's a point, explain, evidence, and a link, or point, evidence, explain, link, whatever way you want to do it round. And so I'm going to argue something like Marxists say that school controls the working class by preparing them for a life in capitalism. We looked at that already. Now you've got to bring a theory or a theorist in. You can pick any of those ones I talked about, but the easiest one is probably going to be Bowles and Gintis, because they talk about the fact that the school literally corresponds to the needs of capitalism. So give that evidence, Bowles and Gintis correspondence principle or correspondence theory. Talk about an example. So think about the way that we're taught to obey rules in the hidden curriculum and how that's going to affect why it's important to obey rules in the capitalist system. If we don't obey what our bosses say, we're going to be out of a job, and that's not going to be good for us. It's not going to be good for capitalism. So we're going to need to learn how to do these things. Now, how am I going to link all this back to the question? What are you going to say? Something like this, like schools are keeping working class in their place through keyword corresponding to the needs of the workplace. But what we've got to try and do in these essays is throw in an evaluation or a criticism of that idea. So this is where you can see that word there. I was going to see if I can roll my mouse over it. However, many working class peoples achieve and go on to achieve good jobs or high status in society. So that's like the argument about Alan Sugar, for instance. Then we're going to bring in the feminist argument. So we've done Marxism, now we're going to cover feminism. Feminists say that schools reinforce patriarchy in society, which keeps women, keyword, marginalised. This is done through, again, the hidden curriculum. You can even talk about gendered subjects as well. But I'm going to throw my research of Becky Francis, because I've already used that word marginalised, and I'm going to talk about Francis' research about how boys dominate space and time in school in order to reflect society. After I've done that, I'm then going to link it all back and say schools keep women in their place through reinforcing these gender roles that girls are seen to have and the boys are seen to have. Then the question doesn't mention functionalists, but we have to bring this in, not least because we need to do 3 paragraphs in a 15-mark essay, but also because we want to show some evaluation. We know it's not just the Marxist and functionalist view of education that's important. So we're going to say that functionalists disagree and that schools are actually meritocratic, and you'll need to explain what meritocratic actually means. So Parsons and Davison Moore all agree with this, and we're going to use Davison Moore's idea of role allocation, talking about how schools sort, sift and select people based on merit, effort and ability for the ultimate role they're going to take in life. And give an example, if you like the one about the artist going on to be a graphic designer. Now, to explain this a little bit more, we're going to talk about the way in which exams award grades based on ability, and that's really helpful for those employers selecting people for uni or jobs and things like that. So if they look at a bunch of candidates, an employer, they're going to go, oh, right, okay, we need a graphic designer. Are we going to pick the kid with an A star in art and A star in graphics, or are we going to pick the kid with a D in art and he didn't take graphics at all, or she didn't take graphics at all? You know, it's that kind of idea. So what we're going to say to link this all back to the question and to criticize it is to say that actually functionalists disagree. Schools don't keep people in their place. We all have equal chance to succeed, and that's meritocracy. Your classic criticism of this is going to be, however, Marxists argue that meritocracy is a myth, right? So bring it all together, nice little conclusion. And by the way, you have to throw in a conclusion on a 15-mark essay if you want to hit that top band. You won't hit it if you don't write that conclusion. So let's just whack in a couple of sentences, different theories of different views, whilst there's evidence to support it from Marxist and feminist view, the idea that education keeps women in the working class in their place. We cannot ignore the meritocratic role that education plays for many people, including working class and women. So that would do a really nice 15-mark essay. That, if you followed that through and followed the steps there, that would get you a top band answer, because you're bringing in keywords, you're bringing in 3 different theories, and you're bringing in criticism as well. So let's just recap what we've done today. We're at about 25 minutes, which is ideal. I went through the functionalist view of the role of education, which ultimately talks about the role that education is a meritocracy, where education is meritocratic, and that schools basically sort and select people according to how much talent they have and how hard they work. We looked at the Marxist view, which disagrees with that. We argued that that meritocracy is a myth, and actually education works in the interest of capitalism and in the interests of the working class, keeping the middle class, keeping working class people going into work, i.e. through learning how to behave in the hidden curriculum. And then we looked at the feminist view, which again argues that women are disadvantaged in education. It's the idea basically that education is almost like a mini patriarchal society, and it gets people used to knowing how things are going to be in terms of gender inequalities. And we looked at the role of Becky Francis and how she argues that boys dominate space and time. And we also looked at Sue Lee's ideas about how sexual double standards can start to creep in that school environment. And we finished it all off just by answering a very typical essay, basically looking at, are Marxists and feminists, do they have the right idea when it comes to the role of education in society? Now, just before I finish, sorry, I've got a bit of a cold today. What I want to mention is, if I've gone a bit quick through this, and if you want some more detail on the theories of education, then I can help you, because there is a podcast that's all about this. The podcast is like 40 minutes long. I go into detail on what each of these theories talks about in terms of the role of education, and you can find that for yourself by searching All Sociology, all one word, wherever you get your podcasts. So Spotify, iTunes, Google Podcasts, wherever you get them. So go and have a listen to that, and hopefully that'll help you out. So that's me finished. I'm going to now come back to my usual screen. Hello again. And just to say thanks again for watching this. I hope it's been helpful for you. If it has, do me the usual thing, which is drop a like on this video, subscribe to it, let your mates know that you found this helpful, because they'll probably find it useful as well if you have. And then finally, the other thing to do is, if you want to go and have a listen to that podcast, please do go and have a check it out, see what you can learn from that. Okay, so that was video number 7. That was all about theories of the role of education system. The next one is going to be starting to look at processes within schools. So looking at things like labeling and that kind of stuff. All right, thanks again for watching. I'll see you later. Take care. Bye-bye.